Welcome to the debate. In February 2026, Americans woke up to a staggering reality.
Truly staggering.
Right. 50,000 United States troops were actively deployed in a massive military operation against Iran. Aircraft carrier strike groups were mobilized, missiles were flying, and the Treasury was rapidly burning through an estimated $47 billion.
A massive, massive scale.
Exactly. And yet, the United States Congress, the body that is constitutionally mandated to declare war, had not cast a single vote. So you have to ask, how does a representative democracy initiate a massive multi-theater war without its elected representatives actually authorizing it?
Well, it looks shocking on its face. Absolutely. I mean, when you see that kind of massive troop movement without a formal declaration from Capitol Hill, the immediate instinct is to call it a constitutional crisis.
Right.
But the reality is that this didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the culmination of decades of established practice, functional necessity, and deeply rooted interpretations of the president's authority.
Which is exactly what we are dissecting today. We're going to look at the scope, the legal architecture, and the ultimate limits of unilateral presidential war powers.
And we're anchoring this into massively consequential recent events. First, the December 2025 legislative repeal of the old 1991 and 2002 Iraq authorizations for use of military force, which, a lot of people thought would rein in the presidency.
Right. It was highly publicized. Exactly. And second, the massive offensive against Iran just 2 months later in February 2026, which kind of proved that those repeals might have just been window dressing. I represent the perspective that this unilateral executive war-making defies the framers' intent, violates the War Powers Resolution, and breaches international law.
And I represent the opposing view, which is that historical precedent and the realities of modern defensive needs provide a highly functional legal framework for the executive branch to act decisively. The core of the issue really comes down to whether the president possesses the inherent legal authority derived from Article 2 of the Constitution and, historical executive prerogative to initiate and sustain these military actions alone.
Right. That's the central tension.
Because when we are dealing with immediate, highly complex global threats, the executive branch relies on these established legal frameworks. Waiting for a fractured legislative body to deliberate simply isn't a survivable strategy in the modern world.
But if we allow functional necessity to override the actual text of the law, what are we even doing? I mean, the constitutional design never intended for executive power to mean an absolute, unquestionable right to wage war on a whim.
Well, proponents of the broad power would say it's not a whim.
Sure, but when we dig into the historical foundations of this, it gets genuinely fascinating. Proponents of this unilateral power often point to the unitary executive theory, the idea that the president holds all executive power, kind of akin to an 18th century English king.
Right.
But modern legal historians are pulling the rug out from under that entirely, aren't they?
You're referring to the recent deep dive scholarship on William Blackstone's commentaries. Blackstone was an English jurist whose writings basically served as the primary legal textbook for the American framers.
Exactly, yeah.
And unitary executive theorists have heavily relied on Blackstone to argue that the English crown possessed absolute, unchallengeable prerogatives over things like going to war. And therefore, the argument goes, when the framers created the American presidency, they endowed it with those same sweeping, king-like powers.
Right, and here is the aha moment that just completely blew my mind when I read legal historian Jed Sugarman's analysis of this. The unitary theorists claim that Blackstone listed removal of officers and unilateral war-making as absolute royal prerogatives. But Sugarman points out that they literally misread the 18th century text.
It's a translation issue, essentially.
Yes. Blackstone didn't say the king had the absolute power of removing officers. He used the word disposing of officers. And in 1765, disposing meant distributing or assigning them, not firing people unilaterally.
Wait, so you're telling me that a massive pillar of modern presidential power might be based on modern lawyers fundamentally misunderstanding an 18th century vocabulary word?
It is a profound historical clarification, I grant you that. I mean, Sugarman's work effectively demonstrates that the English limited monarchy was actually deeply subject to parliamentary supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
The king couldn't just do whatever he wanted without Parliament holding the purse strings. Exactly. And the framers knew that. They took that limited English model and restricted it even further. They explicitly took traditional royal powers like the power to declare war, the power to make peace through treaties, the power to issue letters of marque, and intentionally divided them between the branches.
True.
The President of the United States was actually designed to be significantly weaker than the 18th century English king in matters of war. The text in Article 1, Section 8 is crystal clear. It says Congress has the power to declare war and fund the military.
That is undeniably true regarding Article 1. But let's look at the actual mechanism of how power is granted in the Constitution. The language the framers used is wildly different between the branches. Look at Article 1, which covers Congress. It says all legislative powers herein granted.
Right.
That implies a very strict, enumerated list. You only get what is on the menu. Now look at Article 2, which covers the president. It simply says, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. It notably drops the phrase herein granted.
I mean, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. So you're arguing that omission is essentially a blank check?
Not a blank check, but a massive reservoir of inherent authority. The Constitution explicitly designates the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In foreign affairs and military defense, the president alone represents the sovereignty of the entire nation.
But that was a very different context.
Exactly. We have to remember that the founding era was entirely different. They didn't have a massive standing army. Today, the modern executive commands the most lethal military apparatus in human history and must respond to immediate existential threats globally.
Sure, but
you cannot wait for a deliberative legislative body to debate the nuances of international law when hypersonic missiles are in the air or complex terrorist networks are mobilizing. The Commander-in-Chief clause isn't just an honorary title. It is a substantive grant of operational authority.
Okay, but if we accept that the Commander-in-Chief title implies unilateral war-making, aren't we treating the Constitution like a blank check? I mean, assuming an indefeasible right to wage war when the text explicitly grants Congress the power to declare war is like reading the title of a book and claiming you understand every chapter.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
But if the president can just bypass Congress because the modern world is dangerous, then what is the point of the 1973 War Powers Resolution? Congress literally wrote a law to stop exactly this kind of overreach.
The War Powers Resolution, let's talk about how that actually functions, or rather how it fails to function. Passed in the wake of Vietnam, it was designed to force the president to seek congressional authorization, right?
Yes, Section 5B.
Right, Section 5B says the president has to pull troops out within 60 days unless Congress officially declares war or grants an authorization. But historically, it has been an absolute failure. Legal scholar Noah Feldman recently pointed out that modern presidents from both parties simply ignore that 60-day clock.
But how do they get away with it? I mean, the text of a law is sitting right there. It is a federal statute.
They get away with it through institutional mechanisms, specifically the Office of Legal Counsel, or the OLC. The OLC acts as the internal Supreme Court for the executive branch. When a president wants to launch a strike, the OLC writes a memo providing a legal justification.
A justification that they essentially invent.
Well, once that memo is issued, it acts as a shield. It makes the action legal within the executive branch and protects military commanders from prosecution. For example, President Clinton bombed Kosovo well past the 60-day war powers deadline. He just kept bombing.
And Congress did nothing.
Exactly. And let's look at President Obama in Libya. This is where the semantics get truly creative.
Oh, right. The hostilities argument.
Exactly. The War Powers Resolution triggers when U.S. forces are introduced into hostilities. The Obama administration's lawyers argued that because they were dropping bombs from high-altitude jets and firing missiles from drones, American troops had limited exposure to enemy fire. Therefore, they argued, we weren't actually engaged in hostilities.
Wow. It's brilliant lawyering, and it completely bypassed the statute.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because equating habitual law-breaking with legal authority sets a dangerous standard. Calling it brilliant lawyering is a very polite way of saying they manipulated the dictionary to wage a war without permission.
They interpreted the statute based on modern warfare tactics. Obama's semantic gymnastics over limited exposure basically meant as long as our remote controls reach far enough, we can bomb a sovereign nation forever without asking Congress. But here is my fundamental issue with this entire line of reasoning. Executive violation of a law does not render the law void. Just because multiple administrations have run the red light of the War Powers Act doesn't mean the traffic light ceases to exist.
It doesn't formally void the text, sure, but constitutional law isn't just the parchment under glass at the National Archives. It is the accumulated historical practice of the branches of government.
It's like a jaywalking law in a major city. If the police never issue a single ticket for 50 years and millions of people cross the street illegally every single day, you're saying the text on the books might say it's forbidden, but the reality of the street says it is entirely permitted.
That is exactly how institutional precedent works. When Congress repeatedly acquiesces to unilateral executive action over decades, a new constitutional equilibrium is established. The law, as it is actually practiced, allows for this executive latitude.
But they haven't repealed the law.
Congress possesses the power of the purse. They could defund these operations tomorrow if they really wanted to stop them. Their silence, their failure to pass blocking legislation, is practically a form of consent.
No, I have to stop you there, because the failure of Congress to pass blocking legislation absolutely does not legally equate to an authorization of force. As the great constitutional scholar Lewis Henkin famously noted, Congress must authorize, not simply consult, not simply receive reports, and certainly not just sit quietly in a state of political paralysis when the nation goes to war.
But they are often structurally incapable of acting quickly.
Maybe, but we cannot allow the executive to define the limits of its own power through the mere act of continuously overstepping them.
Then let's pivot to where the executive branch actually does have explicit written statutory authorization from Congress. Because they aren't just relying on inherent authority. Let's look at the AUMFs, the authorizations for use of military force. Basically, Congress's formal permission slip to wage war.
Right, which brings us to recent events.
Yes. In December 2025, the National Defense Authorization Act finally repealed the old 1991 and 2002 Iraq AUMFs.
Which everyone celebrated as a massive reining in of the presidency.
Right, but it was largely symbolic. Because the 2001 Global War on Terror AUMF remains incredibly active and highly elastic. Congress explicitly gave the president the power to use all necessary and appropriate force against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the 9/11 attacks.
The 9/11 attacks, specifically.
Yes, but over the last 25 years, the executive branch has utilized that mandate to address evolving threats. A perfect example of this functional utility happened recently with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Oh, you mean when he equated drug cartels in the Caribbean to al-Qaeda?
Yes. He argued that modern cartels operate as narco-terrorists. The State Department had already designated several of those cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. The intelligence community linked specific maritime vessels in the Caribbean to those designated organizations.
Okay.
Under the umbrella of the 2001 AUMF, the U.S. military targeted those vessels. If the United States is in a state of armed conflict with groups utilizing asymmetric terrorist tactics to funnel lethal drugs that kill Americans, the executive branch must have the flexibility to interpret broad authorizations to meet the threat where it exists today.
Hold on. That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. You are equating a drug cartel in 2026 with the planners of the September 11th attacks. That is not just a stretch. That is ripping the statute to shreds.
It's adapting the statute to modern terrorist tactics.
Applying a 2001 anti-al-Qaeda authorization to a 2026 drug cartel is like taking a 25-year-old fishing license and using it to justify hunting deer on private property today. It stretches the statutory language so far that words lose their meaning entirely.
I don't think the courts would see it quite that simply.
But the 2001 AUMF was explicit. It was for the perpetrators of 9/11 and those who harbored them. period. Expanding that incredibly specific geographical and temporal language to cover modern drug cartels in the Caribbean completely subverts the original legislative intent.
But you are acting as if these threats exist in neat, isolated silos. Terrorist networks fund themselves through narcotics. Narco cartels use terrorist tactics. The Venn diagram has heavily overlapped.
Even so,
if Congress refuses to update the AUMF to reflect the reality of 2026, the executive has an obligation to protect the homeland using the legal architecture currently available.
if a 25-year-old resolution aimed at Afghanistan can legally justify sinking boats in the Caribbean, then we no longer have statutory constraints at all. We just have an executive that legislates its own unlimited authority by creatively manipulating the dictionary.
But stretching a 2001 law to fight cartels is one thing. When you look at the really massive operations, like the 50,000 troops deployed to Iran in February 2026, the executive branch doesn't just rely on domestic AUMFs.
No, they move to international law.
Right. They have an entirely separate, internationally recognized justification. Article 51 of the UN Charter.
Which guarantees the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense.
Exactly. And the executive branch laid out this legal case very clearly. In his March 10 letter to the UN Security Council, U.S. Ambassador Michael Waltz defended the Iran operations by pointing to a continuous, severe threat. He didn't just point to one isolated incident.
Right. He cited a whole history.
He cited a sustained pattern of hostility going all the way back to the 1979 embassy hostage crisis, the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, the 1996 Khobar Towers attack, and ongoing proxy militia attacks. When a state actor operates a decades-long campaign of proxy terrorism and pursues advanced weaponry, it is a sustained menace that practically necessitates preemptive defensive military action under Article 51.
I see why you think long-term risks necessitate action, but I have to bring in the incredibly thorough April 27, 2026 statement from the New York City Bar Association to completely dismantle that argument. They analyzed this exact justification and pointed out a massive flaw in how the administration is interpreting international law.
Based on the imminence requirement?
Yes. Under customary international law, we use something called the Caroline test to define self-defense.
From the 19th century steamboat incident.
Exactly. The Caroline test sets the absolute standard for preemptive self-defense, and it hinges on one word: imminent. For an action to be justified as self-defense, the threat must be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, and absolutely no moment for deliberation.
Which is a very high bar.
You literally cannot have time to think, let alone debate in Congress. Citing 40-year-old grievances like the 1979 hostage crisis to justify a brand new conflict involving 50,000 U.S. troops and $47 billion completely violates that doctrine. A continuous historical menace is not an imminent attack.
But modern warfare and state-sponsored terrorism don't fit neatly into a 19th century test designed for wooden steamboats. When a hostile state actor funds proxy militias across a region, buries advanced nuclear infrastructure deep underground, and continuously threatens regional stability, the very nature of imminence changes.
Does it, though?
Absolutely. You cannot wait for a hypersonic missile to literally be in the air to claim self-defense, because by then, your entire grid is gone. The executive branch must act to address long-term risks before they materialize into immediate catastrophic casualties.
But if we redefine imminent to mean a historical grievance from 40 years ago, we completely collapse the legal distinction between self-defense and a war of aggression. How does one reconcile that with the bedrock principles of the UN Charter? If any nation can point to a 40-year-old attack and say, we feel continuously threatened, therefore we are launching a massive preemptive invasion, the entire bedrock principle falls apart. Every country has historical grievances.
It isn't just historical grievances, it is the active, ongoing funding of proxies that are currently firing on allied positions. The lawyers up and down the chain of command, both in the Pentagon and the State Department, review these operations thoroughly prior to execution to ensure they meet modern defensive standards.
But let's look at how the war is actually being conducted, because it raises grave legal concerns that go beyond just the initial authorization. The Department of Defense's own Law of War manual requires strict adherence to two principles: distinction and proportionality.
Right.
You must distinguish between military and civilian targets, and your force must be proportional to the threat. Yet in this 2026 conflict, we are seeing threats to attack civilian infrastructure, oil refineries, civilian power grids. We are hearing rhetoric from the executive branch threatening to essentially wipe out civilizations. This borders on genocidal language.
While rhetoric and operations are different things.
But this isn't just an abstract legal debate about Articles 2 or the writings of William Blackstone. It is about the United States failing to comply with international humanitarian law, precisely because the president bypassed the deliberative, stabilizing role of Congress. When one person holds all the power, the guardrails vanish.
War is inherently chaotic, and we have to separate operational reality from deterrence rhetoric. Rhetoric from the commander-in-chief, even highly aggressive rhetoric, is often specifically designed for deterrence. It is tactical signaling meant to force an adversary to back down without firing a shot.
A dangerous game to play.
Perhaps, but the fact remains that when facing a highly volatile regional escalation where retaliatory strikes are threatening to drag the entire hemisphere into conflict, the executive needs maximum flexibility. The deliberative process you champion in Congress is incredibly valuable for domestic policy.
But not for war?
In 2026, Congress is so politically fractured and partisan that it took them weeks just to elect a speaker, let alone mount a coherent, timely, and classified global defense strategy. That is the functional reality we live in. Executive latitude isn't just some legal theory cooked up by overzealous lawyers. It is a literal survival mechanism for the nation.
To summarize my perspective, the unilateral actions we are witnessing today demonstrate a severe, dangerous departure from the framers' intent. The 2026 Iran conflict, the deployment of 50,000 troops without a vote, and the dangerous semantic stretching of a 2001 counterterrorism law to hunt cartels all point to an executive branch completely unbound by law.
I understand why you see it that way.
The constitutional design explicitly mandates legislative supremacy in matters of war. By bypassing Congress, leaning on internal OLC memos to ignore the War Powers Resolution, and redefining imminent threat to cover 40-year-old grievances, the executive is violating domestic law and breaching the foundational self-defense requirements of the UN Charter.
And to summarize my view, we cannot govern a 21st century superpower using only 18th century constitutional theory. Despite the inevitable friction with rigid statutory texts, the reality of modern geopolitical threats dictates our actions. Congress is slow, divided, and frankly often willing to let the president take the political risk of military action.
That's certainly true about the political risk.
The executive must utilize existing institutional precedents, broad AUMFs, and modernized interpretations of international self-defense to protect the nation. Swift, unilateral action isn't a usurpation of power. It is a necessary, functional reality of modern statecraft when dealing with hostile state actors and global terror networks.
It is genuinely fascinating to note where our perspectives actually converge. We both clearly recognize that the highly publicized legislative repeal of the 1991 and 2002 Iraq AUMFs back in December 2025 was essentially an illusion.
Absolutely.
It did almost nothing to practically constrain the presidency, given the executive's total reliance on the elastic 2001 AUMF and their broad interpretation of Article 51.
Yeah, the structural constraints on paper rarely match the boots on the ground. The real disagreement we have rests on what that gap between text and reality means for the Republic. Is this unilateral executive latitude a necessary, stabilizing feature of modern global leadership that keeps us safe, or is it a fatal constitutional crisis waiting to collapse the system?
And that is the tension at the heart of American power. Analyzing the mechanisms of war requires looking deeply at how institutions actually operate, rather than how we wish they did. There is so much more to explore within these legal frameworks, the historical precedents of the OLC, and the source materials we've pulled from today.
We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence, look at the text, look at the reality of the threats, and form your own conclusion on where the balance of power should truly lie.
Because ultimately, we have to decide how to read our constitutional blueprint. Are the structural limits of war-making a rigid, load-bearing wall that protects our democracy from slipping into empire, or are they just a preliminary sketch easily erased and continually redrawn by the relentless demands of the modern world.